Dr. Nuno Ribeiro, thank you for joining the Bureau podcast.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. I've been a longtime fan of the podcast, so it's an absolute pleasure to be with you guys today.
That's great to hear. So let's get into some questions about the future of travel in Vietnam.
Sure thing.
My first question is, how devastating has the last 18 months been on small to medium travel businesses in Vietnam?
It's been unprecedented, Matt. In reality, I don't think that the public in general recognizes the economic impact that tourism has in Vietnam. We have some figures that point from anywhere between 8 to 16% of gross domestic product. I think the reality, if we look at direct, indirect, and induced impact, it's probably much higher. But this is a very pertinent question because medium travel businesses in Vietnam have, for the most part, been put on hold or gone into bankruptcy, or they've changed their business model. So it's been very difficult. And I think everyone is doing their best, but really our hearts go out to the families that in some cases have had businesses for decades, and now, because tourism is in essence ground to a standstill, they're not able to do much. The impact has been severe. We do know that tourism is very resilient. We do know that tourism enterprises, especially small ones, and even medium-sized, have an advantage over larger ones, which they don't have the large overhead. But still, it's been devastating. And I think we're all waiting on tourism to pick up. We're all holding on to some hope that when it does pick up, it will be slightly easier for these small and medium enterprises to get back into business. But for sure, it will be a new business model.
And what will be the likely steps involved in opening back up to tourism?
Another great question. This is one of those crystal ball type of questions. The truth of the matter, Matt, is we don't know. We have been following very closely what our neighbors have been doing. Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong. We don't know. One possibility that's been in the works for a while is to have so-called green zone, in which you can travel there if the entire population of the area is vaccinated, if you, the tourist, are vaccinated, if you show that there is proof that you have a negative test within a certain day. That refers to international travel. What I think will happen first is that we will see an opening in domestic tourism, and that will happen piecemeal. You might see something happen in the city level where, okay, you can travel within city limits, then it might open to province level, but it will be very piecemeal. It will be very cautious and very tentative. I'm not sure if you saw in the news today that just this morning, Vietnam has issued an order to stop selling domestic flight tickets, which is an indication that we are being as cautious as we possibly can. But looking ahead, because I have no doubt whatsoever that tourism will rebound, and if history has taught us anything, and if previous tourism crises have taught us anything, is when it does rebound, it will be with a vengeance. I think you're likely to see first domestic tourism will open before international tourism. That's a given. Number two, I very much doubt that you will be allowed to travel, as in for tourism purposes, without some sort of proof or evidence that you have been A, vaccinated, B, that you have had a negative COVID test, and C, a combination of the two. So you'll see an added emphasis on hygiene and security, and it's likely that we will experiment with certain areas. I don't think that the large city centers will be areas for experimentation just because it's so dangerous. The potential for another outbreak is too great. But we've been talking a lot about Phu Quoc. That might be a possibility. So islands are a little bit easier to control. So I think it will be tentative, and I think it will be very piecemeal with, I think, perhaps a certain degree of caution that we have not seen in previous tourism crises. In regard to having the so-called COVID passport or the vaccine passport, the complications on a bureaucratic level are high, as you can imagine, because who's going to issue, now I'm speaking in regard to international tourism, who's going to issue said passports? Are we going to rely on country-to-country agreements? So, for example, say that a Thai tourist wants to visit Vietnam, will we have an agreement in place? Well, okay, we recognize what kind of vaccine passport or vaccine certificate you want to call it from the Thai government. They will recognize ours, or is it going to be a supranational type of organization, such as the World Health Organization, or are we going to leave it up to tourism transportation agencies, things like airlines and so forth? So we don't know. There's likely to be some bureaucratic discussions until we can agree on a model to follow.
Once international travel resumes, what sort of experience do you expect travellers will be looking for in Vietnam?
Oh, wow. That's a phenomenal question. I think we have a possibility that things might go one or two ways. We may have people who have been inside their homes for so long, but at the same time, this is really unprecedented. The length and the impact of this pandemic is unlike any other crisis we've seen in tourism. So people value their safety and security above anything else. One possibility that may occur might be that people will travel not as tourists, which means that they spend the night, but as excursionists. They may go for the day, but then return to their homes, to their usual environment within a 24-hour period. Perhaps an overabundance of caution. That's a possibility. Or they may go and visit their hometown. And that's also a form of tourism where they will feel safe. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that we'll see the opposite, that people have been without travel, which is this basic primal need for so long that, you know what, I'm not going to put off going to the Son Long Caves anymore. I'm not going to put off scuba diving in the Ho Chi Minh Islands. I'm not going to put off that trip that I've been dreaming and planning about for so years. Yes, I want to go on the cable car. I want to go scuba diving. I want to go hang gliding. And we might see slightly riskier behaviors. And the reason, Matt, why when I say we, I mean researchers, why we don't know for sure is that the length of this pandemic is unlike anything else we've seen. And because it hits at the core of a basic human concern, which is your own health and safety, I mean, kind of all bets are off. At this point, we're engaging in a little bit of educated guessing.
In tourism research in which you're heavily involved, what kind of research has been coming out globally and more specifically in Vietnam?
Very good question as well. So we've had a robust body of scholarship on how tourism deals with crisis in general. And that can go from anywhere from an epidemic like we had with the SARS outbreak. It can have to do with events such as 9/11 or the terrorism attacks in Egypt or Morocco. It can have to do with local crisis. So there is a revisitation of the crisis literature and say, hey, you know what? Maybe the models that we've used to prepare destinations for future crisis or to make destinations more resilient and able to recover faster, maybe we need to revisit that. That's on one hand. On the other, and now referring specifically to Vietnam, up until a few months ago, Vietnam was a very interesting case of study because it was a country that has been dealing so successfully with COVID-19 outbreak that when we asked international travelers if the COVID pandemic affected their intention to visit Vietnam, most of them said no. We haven't done enough research recently, and research, as you know, takes a little bit of time to conclude to see if that's changed. We're also seeing a little bit of research in regard to tourism planning and development of destinations such as Vietnam. So Vietnam is very much still an emerging destination. We've just barely broken 100 million tourists a year and a half ago. 2 years ago. And there's still a lot of room to grow. And a lot of the research that's been coming out is this pandemic, because if it has ground tourism to a halt, especially international tourism, has forced us to think more sustainable. It's forced us to develop models in regard to sustainability. Yes, we do want Vietnam to grow, but maybe, no cloud without a silver lining. So maybe this is a great opportunity to requalify our human resources to think of sustainable models of tourism destinations such as Vietnam. So that's some of the other research that's been coming out in regard to the development of Vietnam as a tourism destination. And then lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention there's a little bit of sociological and anthropological research, which is what I study specifically in regard to young travelers coming to Vietnam, which is really, really interesting. And so far, some very preliminary data indicate that the pandemic has not affected their intention to visit Vietnam, which is really, really interesting. it's an exciting time for a researcher. Yes, a little bit scary, certainly very concerning, and we're doing a lot of our research from the comfort of our own homes, but at the same time, very exciting because it represents a unique opportunity for us to understand more. Number one, what kind of destination do we want Vietnam to be? And two, what types or what kinds of tourists do we want to visit us? And when they do visit us, how can we create an experience that will lead to higher return rates?
I'm glad you raised higher return rates. Before COVID-19, what was the return rate?
We had around 13 to 25%, depending on the destination.
Okay, it's a little bit higher than I thought.
Right. It really depends on the destination. So places like Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Phu Quoc, and Hoi An tend to have closer to the low 20s. Vietnam as a whole tends to have in 13, 14. And again, digest these figures with a little grain of salt, right? But in any case, knowing how fantastic of a destination it is, these are low. This is something that we, not just researchers, but government officials, tourism organizations in general, both public, private, or NGOs, we're working very hard to improve. If you look, for example, at our neighbors, Thailand, they have a revisitation rate anywhere from 30 to 40%. Which is something that we obviously want, right? We want a tourist who visits Vietnam to come back and to keep coming back. That's at the essence of a sustainable development model, because you develop a sense of attachment towards the country. You're more likely to stay longer. You're more likely to understand it better. Cultural clashes are less likely to be significant. You're more likely to understand the country a little bit better. You're more likely to be invested in the country and its sustainable development. So really good question, Matt.
What's something out of the box we can or might expect from travel agencies to get people to travel to Vietnam?
I think you will see something that's already started happening. You'll start to see direct routes from our primary market, which so far as you know are China, South Korea, some European countries, and the United States. We are very, very, very close to have direct flight routes to the United States, which would be remarkable. So on one hand, we will see an ease of transportation with fewer and fewer stopping points en route to Vietnam. That's one thing we will see. And then the second one, I think we will see, at least for 2021, if there is travel in 2021, which I don't want to say no, but I think it's highly unlikely. But for the tail end of 2022 and 2023, I think you will see a reduction in price like we haven't seen before, especially from large organizations at the tourism and hospitality level. We are likely to see prices, even at the luxury level, be reduced even more. They were already reduced significantly last year, but I think now, because the overhead is so significant, they're likely to reduce them even more. And they'll do something else. They will add value. I think we are likely to see the return of group travel. We're likely to see the return of the package holiday. Because remember, one of the advantages of a package holiday is that everything is planned in advance for you. So one of the elements in that planning process are issues of safety and security. So we're likely to see a packaging of Vietnam as an attractive destination where all the itinerary is set on the outset with very, very attractive pricing strategies.
And do you think there'll be a particular traveller that will come from a particular region of the world?
It's a good question. If previous research is any indicator, we have started to notice that younger and younger travelers are coming to Vietnam. And I'm talking of people in their late teens and early 20s. And I'm not referring just of backpackers. I'm referring to middle class, well-established individuals that are either beginning their university career or they're at the tail end of their university career, but for whom Vietnam has a certain allure, has a certain mystery. And we're also seeing the rise of the individual traveler, but not the traveler as in the backpack that might go and explore Vietnam over the course of a month or so. We're seeing a slightly shorter stays that go anywhere between 1.5 weeks to 2.5 weeks, which is really, really interesting. I think the type of travel that we're attracting, in addition, of course, to business travelers, There's some visiting friends and relatives, primarily from Canada and the United States, some European countries. We're seeing young travelers, and these are coming primarily from South Korea, the United States, France, and Germany, which is really interesting because from those countries, we used to have a much older demographic in the past. And I think that post-COVID, we will see younger and younger travelers come to Vietnam in larger numbers.
What impact do you think the new airport in Long Tan, which is just outside of Ho Chi Minh City, will have on Ho Chi Minh City as a place to visit?
I think it will be fantastic. I think long overdue. And if airports such as Gatwick are any indication, I think we will see an increase in international travel. First, because it allows for an increase in the number of offering of flights. And second, because it will allow for much greater flexibility. So if you are planning on traveling to Vietnam, but say that maybe your first stop is not Ho Chi Minh City, you might skip staying at the main airport and stay at this new one and travel to your other destination in the country. Any infrastructure development such as airports tend to have a very positive impact on tourism development in just about any country, and Vietnam is no exception. Current airport is just about at capacity. It was a wise decision to build another one rather than try and upgrade the current one, which was in the works. And I think that some upgrading may occur in the not so distant future, but I think it will have a positive impact. We are hopeful as well that development of the new airport will be integrated with other forms of transportation, such as the subway, such as roadways, trains, so that they're integrated in a multimodal form of transportation, so it gives even more options to international travelers.
You mentioned that international travelers might fly into the new airport and then go directly on to other places, perhaps go up the coast or something like that. Does that mean that they might skip Ho Chi Minh City altogether?
I've been living in Ho Chi Minh City for a while, so I guess I'm a little bit of a Saigonese at heart. I think Ho Chi Minh City is unscapable. I think there's such an allure that the vast majority of tourists will visit Ho Chi Minh City. The exception might be with either business travel or actually with sport tourists that not a lot of people know, but it's a growing market segment in Vietnam. There are certain areas in Vietnam that just lend themselves to the practice of certain types of sport, competitive fishing, windsurfing, kayaking, and so forth. And in that case, if you're coming to Vietnam with a very specific reason, then you may not feel like you have time to visit Ho Chi Minh City. But I really hope they don't, because it's one of my favorite cities in the world, and it's definitely worth a visit.
I agree. I think it's the best city in Vietnam for sure. Now,
absolutely.
Finally, what destination in Vietnam do you think will become a must visit for the first time ever after COVID-19?
Oh man, you're putting me on the spot here, Matt. Okay. Do you want an answer as a researcher, or do you want a personal one?
I think go with a gut feeling.
Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. I think that's it, because it's a city that is so vibrant and that changes literally within the blink of an eye. That I'm speaking for international travelers. For international travelers who have not been to Vietnam, I'm not sure if I'm sure you've been keeping up with the news recently, but right now Ho Chi Minh City is very much deserted with the current lockdown measures, but it irradiates this beauty, right? That's incredibly attractive for tourists and for us who are residents here. So I think that mystique will carry. And I think we will see certain dramatic changes in regard to tourism here in Ho Chi Minh City. In regard to tourists who may have been to Vietnam before, I think that the next major destination will probably be Hue City. It is, for some reason that we researchers haven't been able to really explain very well, it's undervisited, except for domestic tourists. But I think that's more for historical and cultural purposes. But there is so much to see and do in Hue that I think that might be the next big thing. But again, speaking as a resident of Ho Chi Minh City, I think this will be it.
I love your answer. Dr. Nuno Ribeiro, thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Matt. It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me anytime.